Welcome to SingulariT training, and welcome to this set of video in the JHipster series. In this set of video, we'll talk about the Java classes that are generated by JHipster. JHipster generated a set of classes for SpringBoot, but it also added a lot of components, including connection to Prometheus, Keycloak, Vue.js, Mongo. It even had connection to its own library and also some connection to Logback. It's all good work that you will not have to do when you go in production, so it's already made for you. That's a really good thing. Although we discussed Vue.js, MongoDB, this video still applies to Spring Boot generated by JHipster. Even if you're using a SQL database, it will be very close because it's using the data repository from Spring Data. Now, that creates a lot of confusion around Spring Boot, and we need to figure out our way out of this. We need to understand how it works to be able to enhance our newly generated service. This video will be split in 3 parts. This is the video number 1 out of 3. The first thing I want to do is to connect to the database and take a look at the table that were created in the project. It's not table, it's connection. If we would be talking about SQL, we would be talking about tables. We talk about document store, we talk about collections. There's a couple collections that we need to take care of. There's the GHI, which is JHipster collections. We have the mission and the space event, which are our own object. And we have the DB changelog. The DB changelog is by MongoDB. Basically, MongoDB has a script, which is 01 add authorities, and it basically added 2 authorities in the table. It added the authorities, role user and role admin. It's a JSON object. We also have some persistent audit event, and the audit event contains some data with the session ID and the remote address. We will see them in the Java code a little bit later. We also have the user, the JHipster user, and the user here is created based on the OpenID connect information. At first I would talk that the event and the user come directly from Keycloak, but no, JHipster creates a copy of the user, a copy of the authorities locally, and sync them with your identity provider. That way, JHipster always have a copy in the database. What we see here is that our user has 2 authorities, and those are link to ID from role user and link from ID from all admin. And those 2 ones are relationship that are stored into an array. If we would do the same thing using SQL database, we would have the user, a table between the user and the authorities, and the authority table. So we would have 3 tables. In that case, we have 2 collections. Those fields here, created date, last modified by, and last modified date, are fields that are created by Mongo repository automatically using a component that we'll see in Java. Our mission object is pretty standard. It's only a name and description. And the space event is an event, the landing of rover, which is attached to our mission using a single reference. It's a one-to-one relationship, so it's not an array on this one, it's only an object. So that's about that for the collection and the structure. Now, let's import our project. So a new project from existing source, and we'll go on the Vue.js KeyC for Keycloak English. And we'll import it using the model from Maven. It's already a Maven project, so IntelliJ will find out how it works and we'll open it in the current window. The first thing we see is that we have this README that was generated for us by JHipster. It contains information about starting the project. You have this npm install, which means that npm will look at the JSON package and find out which component need to be added locally. The remaining of the project is like before, so Maven wrapper to start it, or npm start if you want to do some development using Webpack. Some notification here about @0 OpenID connect, because if we're using the component as a standalone with the Maven wrapper, or if we're using it in IntelliJ to run it locally, the local host is already our machine. But if we run the application as a Spring Boot microservice in a Docker, in that case, localhost from the Docker will be the IP address from the Docker, and it will not resolve. So unless we change the localhost for something else, it will just not work. Let's look at the project. In the project, we have the Webpack. We will not talk about that. We'll keep that for the UI section. We have the target where everything is generated, and we see that under classes, there's a static section with the app. And the app is bundled as a JavaScript bundle here as a static folder. And that folder, the target static app, will be used later on in the configuration. So that's only why I show it to you at this point. We will first start with the resources. There's a lot of resources configuration that we can use to configure the application and that we will leverage later on. The first one is logback Spring. It's a configuration for logback. It goes through all the logger name and define the logging level by default. It also defines here a context listener that will reload the logging configuration if they are changed using the management endpoint. We have the banner, which was created by JHipster. You can replace by your own. We have the error HTML template. I think this one is only used when you don't have any Vue app. So if you convert your microservice and only run the microservice, in that case, you could reach the error HTML when there are mistakes. And there's some bundle properties here for message properties, which covers the error translation. It also covers some translation from extra feature we don't use, like the registration and the email reset. We don't do reset password, we delegate that to Keycloak. So we don't use that part of the bundle. We also have the Swagger API. This one is created because we choose API design first. It basically creates us an open API Swagger file with some basic info, and the paths are empty. It's where we will add new endpoint for our service, which are not database services. So if we have new API to design, we will add them here under path, and then they will be generated. It also includes the component for response, because we will transfer response or of errors as problem object. And the problem object is an application/problem in JSON. It's a specific RFC, but it needs to be defined in the API for the generation. So our API will be able to respond as problem too. The configuration here, we have liquid-based data, which is probably a leftover from the users because we don't create users using liquid-based. Liquid-based is for SQL, so it's probably just leftover. And we have a key store. The key store is there if you want to do HTTPS configuration. Application is the set of configuration that SpringBoot will load. Application dev, prod, TLS are extra configuration when you add profile, when you change profile. The application defines the base, the dev and the prod define add-ons or different things based on the application. So let's look at the application itself. It has a couple of main parts. The management part. The management part defines how the SpringBoot management interface are configured. So basically, there's an endpoint with the base path management. Everything under management is part of the management endpoint from SpringBoot. It's called sometimes the actuator. And they expose the configuration, the environment, the health of the system, some info, some metrics from JHipster, some log files, loggers, the endpoint from Prometheus to show you how long it takes for your request to be processed, and thread_dom is for debugging too. Those endpoints for the health, which is the status of the system, is only accessible with full detail when you have the role admin. Otherwise, it will just say up or down for the microservice. The metrics JHipster are enabled. You have full information about the Git. Maybe we want to cut down a little bit eventually in prod. The mail is not monitored because we don't have that component that allows us to reset password by email. It will all be done in Keycloak, but we could monitor the mail here at the same time. We get some export from Prometheus, which will be updated every 60 seconds, and we'll be able to start Prometheus and Grafana to show stats of our service. But that will be another video where I will talk about Prometheus and Grafana with JHipster. It enables HTTP, so any requests incoming or outgoing will be logged as a duration. The JVM data, the logs from logback, maybe we should put that off. No, the stats from logback, the stats from process and system, all fine. And there are some percentiles. It means that it will place requests in some buckets, so we can compare how many are slow, how many are fast. Application name as a tag. So basically pretty standard for the endpoints. Now, Spring also has some configuration. Spring has an application name, Spring profile, Java management and extensions, so we can know what's happening with the JVM. Some message for translation, mainly for team leaf, I think. Some task execution, because we want to control a schedule of some job. We have some cleanup in the audit events to do every 30 days. And for that, we need to have some scheduling. We also have some configuration for OAuth 2, which will redirect to our Docker running keycloak. Some cookie configuration about the session. We may have something to do to make sure that it works on HTTPS also for the session, to make sure that everything is fine. We will display a ribbon on profile to indicate that we're running dev. And then we go on JHipster. So JHipster itself has a Java class that handles typical configuration of JHipster, including the application name, the original mail that we don't use, some Swagger documentation. If you want to expose your Swagger API, it would be great to put more description about the contact in the email if you want to have your API accessible from the outside, and some setup for security. Those are refined more deeply in dev, and the dev will add some log debug at sub-level. Our package is in debug, and JHipster also is in debug. Even root is in debug. Maybe it's a little bit too much. We have the Spring profile, which is dev, and it includes Swagger, which means that by including Swagger, it will start the Swagger UI and the API component. We will see a little bit later in the Java version how this is used to control what gets activated or not. We have some restart enable, and we have some package excluded from that, and we have some live reload. It will help us restarting the application, reloading the static resources. We indent the output in Jackson, so the JSON generated will be user-friendly a little bit. Data Mongo, we have a connection. It's pretty much a duplicate of what we have in prod, but it's logical that prod and dev will change, so it makes sense to have them duplicated here. Same thing for port. And then we have other configuration for JHipster, so the cache, the EH cache. We change the number of caches, only 100 entries in local. In prod, it's 1,000. We activate the CORS header here, but for anybody, so basically we disable it. The CORS header are used when you call an API using a browser, and the browser first asks with the method options what it can do with the API, and the response will be that you're allowed or not to call this API depending on the URL you're calling. By allowing anything, it means that even if you're working with Webpack on a different host name like localhost and you're running a different port, even if you're requesting a URL for the API, from the browser, it will be still allowed because the CORS header are allowed. We have the login here for JSON format. If we use JSON format, we can send the log directly to Logstash. And Logstash, if you don't use the JSON format, Logstash will have to parse the log and find out the properties in the log. If we use the JSON format, some information in the log will be by attributes, so the package name and all those stuff will be by attributes, the log level, and it will be easier in Logstash to filter them out and to search them using something like Elastic Logstash Kibana setup will be easier if we send them in JSON. But logging in JSON locally is a little bit painful, so we keep that for when we have Logstash active. Audit events are cleared after 30 days. It's part of the task we have. The prod is fairly similar. The logs are a little bit higher. Some metrics are not exported. Primitives may be a little bit too speaky. The Mongo, the mail are duplicated. It's okay. The Server, we had the compression. Adding compression will make sure that when we send the result to the client for text, HTML, XML, JSON, JavaScript, anything that we send almost, we will compress them using JZip, which will take less bandwidth. In local dev, we don't really want to do that. It's taking just more CPU on the SpringBoot, more CPU on our client, on our browser. Good, so we have some configuration for the cache. We have the max entries in EH cache, which is at the 1000, a little bit higher. Mail you don't really have, login mode. That's about it for configuration of the resource. Thanks for watching this first video in the set of 3 about Spring Boot. If you find the video useful, don't forget to like it before you go to the second video. Thanks for watching.